This is Intelligence Matters.
I'm Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Bojan Panchevski, the Chief European Political Correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Previously the journal's Germany correspondent, he has been reporting on European affairs for almost 2 decades. His recent work centers on Russian aggression in Ukraine and the Kremlin's clandestine operations in Europe. Mr. Pancevski joins us today to discuss his recent article titled, "A New Spy Unit is Leading Russia's Shadow War with the West," where he sheds light on Russian intelligence operations, their strategic objectives, and the geopolitical implications of their activities. Stay with us as we talk with Bojan Panchevski. Bojan, thank you so much for joining Intelligence Matters.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, a big topic in intelligence circles for most of the last couple of years has been Russian sabotage and subversion across Europe. There have been a number of incidents, and we want to get into them. But you just had a blockbuster story recently about a new spy unit that's leading Russia's shadow war against the West. So this was perfect timing, and we're so glad that you would come on to discuss this article. And you've also broken other stories about what Russia has been up to in Europe. Can I ask you just here at the outset, just to sort of walk through your article, and in particular, the new spy unit, which I believe is called the Department of Special Tasks?
That's right. So it's actually a department, not a unit. And it may sound kind of bureaucratic lingo, but it's very important because a department actually contains several units. And we know of at least 3 units that have been incorporated into this new department. The department, for all we know, was set up somewhere early 2023. And it was set up with the explicit purpose of kind of forming this iron fist in an iron glove for what the Russians perceive as the conflict with NATO, with the West. And this unit has specifically been authorized and formed, in fact, to deal with NATO countries and also to operate globally, so that it has a global remit, but in the course of the war, of the Russian war in Ukraine, it has kind of assumed this forward-leaning posture in the conflict against NATO. It has sort of at least 3 units and at least kind of 3 areas of operation. One area, and the most important, I think, for my article and the stuff that I was looking into, is clandestine operations in the West, predominantly in Europe. So that's one very important area, very dangerous, obviously very sinister. And that unit that does that is the same unit. It's an existing unit that was incorporated into this department. And that unit is responsible for previous high-profile operations of the GRU, the military intelligence of Russia. For example, the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Britain. They were the ones behind that. They were also behind a string of kind of sabotage attacks, notably one major attack on a military warehouse military kind of ammunition warehouse in the Czech Republic. I think it was in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. 2 people died in the explosions. And this was ammunition that was meant to be sent to Ukraine. So it's a very dangerous lethal unit that was folded into the new department. The other 2 areas of operation are essentially recruiting foreign agents. Russia and the Soviet Union before it is very good at recruiting foreigners for its cause. And they have been very actively recruiting especially since the war in Ukraine started 3 years ago. They've been recruiting mainly in friendly countries, but they've been recruiting across the board, including in so-called countries of the global south. They've been recruiting in Afghanistan. They've been recruiting in the Balkans, in Serbia notably. And they've been recruiting as well Ukrainian refugees, Russian-speaking Ukrainian refugees, possibly with pro-Russian kind of posture. And they've been training them for various operations.
So let's just drill down for a second. Why is it a new department, and why isn't it in one of the more traditional intelligence elements that we've heard about within Russia?
The new department was formed because in the run-up to the war and in the first year of the war, Russian intelligence was seen to have suffered terrible setbacks. The FSB, which is the big, so there are kind of three main intelligence agencies in Russia. The FSB is domestic, the biggest intelligence agency. Then there is the GRU, the military intelligence agency, which is under the auspices of the Ministry of Defense, and it's probably the most brutal, the most lethal of the three. And then the third one is the SVR, is the foreign intelligence, and is generally considered to be more kind of gentleman-like. You know, there are spies who steal secret, but they don't really kill anyone. Apparently, they haven't killed anyone since the early 80s. So all of the three were seen to have failed in the run-up to the invasion and in the immediate aftermath, because Russia suffered a major setback. There was this idea that Russia will just kind of march into Ukraine, take Kiev, replace the government, and have a victory parade. And that obviously didn't happen. They got punched back really hard. And part of the reason for that, only part of the reason, but still part of the reason for that, was the bad intelligence they were getting, in the eyes of the Kremlin at least. So at some point, a decision was made to essentially reform the intelligence posture and the intelligence operations. And one major blow to Russian intelligence gathering and clandestine operation came in the immediate aftermath of the full-scale invasion in 2022, when European countries basically kicked out collectively something like 500 or 600 diplomats or people who were intelligence agents, really, but operating under the guise of diplomatic immunity in various consulate and embassies across Europe. So that kind of removed, for example, the GRU operatives, which were perfectly legally operating in European capitals. And then they had to kind of fall back on a different way of working behind what they see enemy lines in Europe. So essentially, they took a step back. They reconfigured their way of working in Europe, and they set up this new department, which is now largely invested in a kind of a proxy war. They changed the way of operating. They are using proxies. Proxies are kind of people who are often unaware who they work for. Sometimes they're ordinary students. Sometimes they're Ukrainian refugees. Sometimes they are hardened criminals. They get contacted on social networks quite often, and they get offered a bit of money or a lot of money to perform certain criminal activities, which range from surveillance and spying to setting public transport buses on fire, as it happened in Prague in the Czech Republic last year, to beating up dissidents, as it happened with associates of the late Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader, and so on and so forth. And so they basically reinvented themselves a little bit by using proxies, by using so-called illegals. Illegals are basically spy operatives that are not registered anywhere. They're not part of any embassy. They're operating illegally under false identities.
Right.
And so on.
So let's talk a little bit about, I want to get to the question of why they do this, and we'll get there in a minute, but let's back up a little bit. I want to understand what we think this particular department has been up to. I think you also broke a story within the last year or so about the DHL package bombs. To me, those seemed particularly brazen, because what if they had knocked a plane out of the sky? That seemed especially reckless. Could you tell us a little bit about that episode?
Yeah, that was in a way a kind of a culmination of their activity. So I just wanted to say one thing. What is important about setting up a whole new bureaucracy? It may sound kind of boring and administrative, but actually it's extremely important, because when you set up a dedicated new department, which is a fairly large department, which has at least hundreds of people working for it, if not thousands, you set up a dedicated bureaucracy of highly trained professionals, some of them extremely ruthless and veterans of these operations, A lot of them are assassins, saboteurs, people like that, special operations experts. And when you put them all together, give them a bit of money and give them a very broad brief to just create mayhem in NATO countries and especially in Europe. And then you let them be and they operate on their own. That is very important because then they have 24/7 sort of activity of coming up with crazy plots and ideas of how to harm the interests of NATO countries on their own territory. So that's very important. By having that department alone, the fact that you have a department consisting of highly trained and dangerous people who are being paid to come up with conspiracies against the West is extremely important.
But let me just ask you, because I agree with you, setting up a new department is quite a move. Who do they report to, and who leads this particular new department?
So there are two leaders of this department. There are two generals. One of them is General Averyanov. He's quite a notorious GRU operative who's been around for decades. He was given by Putin himself the highest honor of the Russian Federation. I think it's called Hero of the Russian Federation for his role in taking Crimea, in the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the Ukrainian peninsula that was annexed forcefully by Russia. He's a veteran of many wars. I think he first served in the war in Afghanistan, in the occupation of Afghanistan in the 80s. His deputy is General Ivan Kasyanenko. He's kind of a shady figure. Averyanov is kind of well known in Western intelligence circles, and he's been sanctioned by various countries, notably, I think, by the European Union, and he's wanted in Czechia for his role in the attack on the ammunition factory that we mentioned earlier. Kasyanenko is a bit of a shadowy figure. He's not sanctioned. He comes from the Air Force. It's very interesting. Originally, he was a pilot, which is fairly typical for the GRU to recruit from within the armed forces. But I've not kind of heard about other Air Force people being in commanding positions like that. He served in various diplomatic roles. Notably, he was posted to Tehran. He speaks apparently Farsi, the Persian language. He was posted in Afghanistan, where he was recruiting Afghans for the Russian intelligence services. And now he plays a major role in kind of coordinating the Russian presence in Africa, which is also one big headache for the West, because the former empire of Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin's friend, who ran the Wagner private army and who was essentially killed by Putin after he staged a coup against him. He left this empire behind him. A lot of it is in Africa, and now the Russian state has taken over that empire. The Ministry of Defense and the GRU are essentially managing most of it.
Right.
And Kasyanenko is playing a key role in that as well.
So these are some real killers.
Yeah, absolutely. They're hardened professionals. Both of them are just over 50 years old, I believe. So they're extremely kind of experienced, seasoned operatives with a lot of kind of clandestine and lethal operations below their belts.
So it's a new department headed by really hardened intelligence officers with a very broad remit to wreak mayhem, at least in Europe and maybe worldwide. But tell us a little bit more about the DHL plot, and maybe also about the Rheinmetall CEO who they targeted for assassination. Is this payback for Europe helping Ukraine? Or is this just to sow mayhem, as we say, or both?
It's both. And the one comes from the other. I think they're quite related. I mean, just to quote, the heads of the British intelligence agencies, MI6 and MI5, last year spoke publicly about this particular issue. And I think their statements came after the DHL conspiracy was foiled. And they both essentially said Russian intelligence has been given a broad brief by Putin to sow mayhem on the streets of Europe and Britain. I think that was an explicit quote. And I think that's exactly what's happening, according to my research. The activities of this new department, known by the abbreviation SSD, peaked in the summer of last year. And sometime between May and July or August, the most kind of violent conspiracies were taking place. And I think the worst among them that we know of was the DHL incendiary devices conspiracy. Essentially, it consisted of shipping incendiary devices, which were cloaked in electric massage things, like electric massages that you would order from the internet on Amazon or whatever. They were filled with a special magnesium mixture, which is, or at the time was at least, completely undetectable by the conventional screening systems that shipping services and airports have in Europe and America. And they were shipped out of Eastern Europe to addresses in Britain. And the ultimate plan was to ship them to North America, to the United States and to Canada. So the investigators I spoke to and the intelligence people who were involved in kind of stopping this conspiracy believed that they had stopped the dry run for an operation which intended to send these incendiary devices on airplanes flying to Britain, Canada, and the United States, and that it was very much a grave possibility that one of these devices would catch fire while mid-air, and that it will bring the airplane down.
Well, can I just stop you there? A possibility. Did they intend for it to blow up on the plane, or they intended the recipient of the package to get blown up?
So the recipients were random. The recipients were not the target. So it is believed that the chain of transport was actually being targeted, and that the planes were ultimately the target. As it were, in the event, in this so-called dry run, 2 or 3 of these devices caught fire while on the ground. And what happened was they were shipped via the DHL service, which is kind of a German logistics giant based in Germany but operating worldwide. They were shipped from Vilnius in Lithuania in Northeast Europe to addresses in Britain and I think America. And what happened was they caught fire while in transit on the tarmac. And the then head of the German domestic intelligence service, who has since retired, he said that the only reason why this happened on the ground was that one of the connecting flights was late. So when the connecting flight was late, the device caught fire on the tarmac while being carried by a forklift. Had the plane come on time, the device would have ignited in the hold, in the kind of baggage department of the airplane. And the German police, which recreated these devices in a forensic lab and tested them under all circumstances, they told me that there is no way to put out that fire while on board a flight, because airplanes have systems to put out fires, but these systems are conventional and they either take out the oxygen from the room or they use sprinkles of water. But none of that would have helped, because this is a magnesium mixture that can actually burn underwater, and it can burn without oxygen. So in my article, if people want to click on the link, they will see we have pictures from CCTV cameras. We obtained footage from an airport in Birmingham where one of these devices ignited while being carried with a bunch of boxes in a forklift. And the pictures are 2 or 3 seconds apart. And in the first picture, you can see kind of a tiny little flame. That's the device igniting. And the second picture, the entire forklift is engulfed in this fire. And that's how they work. So it's kind of terrifying. I mean, the police that actually investigated this and was privy to classified information about what these things can do were absolutely terrified, because there was a sense that if you send dozens or even hundreds of these devices, which are extremely cheap and easy to send, you may cause, you may kind of destroy the entire air traffic system, because obviously once this happens and God forbid a plane is lost, then, all planes will be grounded immediately. It's kind of a 9/11 scenario. So it was taken extremely seriously, and it was extremely scary for investigators and intelligence people working on this.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to draw distinctions between all these acts of sabotage, but and they're all gray zone activities, I think. But this one is almost terrorism, to actually try and knock
I spoke
plane
to
out of the sky.
A bunch of people, including in the American system, former and present, operatives in the intelligence community, and they basically said this is Russia crossing a line, because Russia never wanted to be a terrorist state, because the Russians have a pretty hard line on Islamic terrorism, and once upon a time they actually cooperated with the West on combating Islamic terrorism. And now you have a situation where they are preparing terror plots. To the extent that, the White House at the time was informed of this, and they were so worried that they basically picked up the phone. I think then National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan called Yuri Ushakov, who's a senior aide to Vladimir Putin, and he's also a former ambassador to the United States. And then William Burns, who was the former head of the CIA at the time last year, he called two of his counterparts in Russia, Sergei Shoigu, who is the most senior security official, and Naryushkin, who is the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service. And both American officials basically told them to stop. Now, the feedback they got apparently was that the Kremlin was not aware of this. So there was a narrative that essentially this department had gone too far. They've been given a broad brief, and they kind of pushed the envelope and kind of organized this terror attack without the explicit approval of the Kremlin, which obviously we'll never know whether that's true or not. I mean, that's what the Americans were told. That's what the Russians told me in my research. They said basically that Ushakov, who is very close to Putin, was shocked when he found out about it. He never approved it. He never would have approved it. Now, whether or not we want to believe that, it's very difficult to know. Essentially, it is obviously possible that Putin tells his generals, go raise hell. And then they take it a bit too far, and they take it literally. It's quite that is an obvious scenario, because I think overall, as someone who's very knowledgeable about the operation of the secret services in Russia, told me Putin will punish them for underperforming, but he's not going to punish them for overperforming, and they obviously know that. So it's well possible that this happened. It could also well be that Putin was informed and he didn't care. I don't think we'll ever know. But in any event, this was so impactful potentially that the White House had to get involved.
Yeah. So you mentioned that some of these activities peaked last summer, and that seems to coincide with the DHL plot. Do you think this is okay? So this is when they started to pull back a little bit?
Well, I think they started to pull back after that phone call. The phone call took place, I think, in late August. And I think they were explicitly asked to stop. And obviously, I don't know whether or not the Americans threatened any type of retaliation. But I think the most impactful plots did stop, because one parallel plot that was unfolding parallel to this DHL thing was a very elaborate plot to assassinate the heads of the biggest European defense contractors that are essentially supplying Ukraine with weapons and ammunition. And I was told there was a kind of a hit list, a death list of around a dozen of chief executives of companies in Europe. And I don't know who they are except for one, and that's Armin Pappenberger. He's the chief executive of Rheinmetall, which is one of the biggest defense contractors in the world, and I think it's the biggest manufacturer of shells in Europe, if I'm not mistaken. And they're extremely important for supplying Ukraine with shells as well as with tanks and armored vehicles and other hardware such as artillery and so on. So there was a very detailed plot to take out Mr. Pappenberger, and that plot was foiled essentially by U.S. intelligence that shared what they knew with the German authorities, and then the German authorities provided very strong security for the chief executive. Essentially, they told me he's now security they invest in his kind of case is greater than that of the Chancellor of Germany. So that tells you something. He would not comment for my article, but I was told, and I think he even said this publicly in Ukraine once, that now he has at least 2 bodyguards that basically live in his house with his family.
Yeah.
And I was told that his house and his offices have all been adapted with special security measures in order to prevent the assassination. So that's a pretty big deal. I mean, that never happened. Not even in the worst days of the Cold War did the Soviets go around and kind of bump off European or American executives, in the private sector. That's not definitely something new and something extremely brazen.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Bojan Panchevski.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
So, what else can we attribute to this new Russian Department of Special Tasks? You mentioned the poisoning of Skripal, but that may predate this particular department.
That predates. The people who did that basically are now integrated in the new department.
Now integrated. Okay.
Yes, I mean they're very big on cyber attacks. They have a huge cyber warfare capacity, offensive one. They are also very big on propaganda. They're very big on basically running proxies to do nefarious activities in the West. I mean, they were paying people to do stuff ranging from painting anti-Semitic graffiti, following kind of, to kind of take advantage of the mood of the tensions after the attack on Israel and the subsequent Israeli attack on Gaza. There was a lot of tension in Europe, which has a sizable Muslim migrant population or minority, and the Russians were trying to kind of exploit these tensions by manufacturing sort of anti-Semitic graffiti and things like that. There was, in another case, they set fire to a warehouse that was storing Starlink devices for Ukraine in near London. Mm-hmm. And they paid essentially a proxy who did that for them. That person was arrested and is now on trial or being prosecuted in Britain. And I think he even admitted having worked for Russian intelligence services or the Russian state. There was an attack on the public transport in Prague where a guy, a kind of South American student or whatever, set fire to a bus. There were a string of attacks on industrial sites across Europe. There was a major fire in a shopping center in Warsaw, which has been attributed to this department as well. It's unclear whether they used their own operatives or they used proxies. There was a foiled attack. Many attacks were also focused on Ukraine. So these guys are also operating inside Ukraine. The Ukrainian security service told me of this very elaborate attack or plot to set fire on a chain of home improvement stores and a cafe. They actually arrested a group of people, basically proxies who were hired by the Russian intelligence. And they used incendiary devices, which were sort of similar to the ones that were then later used for the DHL plot. Not exactly the same.
Yeah.
They were more conventional, but they were incendiary devices. The idea was to kind of start major fires in crowded stores.
What about the recent cutting of undersea power cables? Who's behind that?
Well, that is a very murky business. There are a number of incidents, and all of them involve ships that were carrying Russian cargo. but Western investigators and prosecutors have not been able to arrest anyone or prosecute anyone or find any evidence of a state actor being behind these incidents. There were, in the last year or so, there were 4 major incidents like that, cutting of data cables and a pipeline in one case. But there was no evidence whatsoever about who's behind that. And obviously the captains of these ships always claim that these things are accidents. So I have no information sort of indicating that the new department is in any way involved in that sort of activities. So I wouldn't know. I don't think they are, because no one's ever mentioned it.
Yeah. Going back to the Nord Stream 2 incident, which I guess since the press has put it onto the Ukrainians, that's more or less been established. How much of those types of acts by the Ukrainians inspired the Russians to really push the envelope across Europe and within Ukraine?
Yeah, funny you should mention that. I broke that story about Ukraine being behind that very elaborate act of sabotage.
Yeah.
Definitely, it's because the Russians believe that the Ukrainians were at least helped by the CIA. And I think originally they claimed that the CIA was behind it. And even today, when Putin talks about it, he talks about Anglo-Saxons. Anglo-Saxons transported from the Middle Ages to blow up the Russian pipelines. But essentially, that is absolutely what's happening. The Russians are in a totally different mindset than people in the West. The Russians believe they are at war with the West. They believe this is a hybrid type of war. Obviously, they're not, tanks are not rolling across the borders. They're not shooting missiles into the cities in Europe, but they do believe they are in a state of conflict. And I don't think that's the same for most people in the West, including politicians and security officials. Some security officials, especially in Eastern Europe, are much more cognizant of this kind of hybrid war we're in. I mean, I was at the Munich Security Conference last week, which is a kind of global gathering of security and foreign policy experts and officials. And the Prime Minister of Denmark, who's quite hawkish, I think, on Russia, and it's a Baltic nation that has seen a lot of these incidents happen. The Prime Minister said, a hybrid car is a car, and a hybrid war is also a war. It's a different type of war, but it's still a war. And I think that sort of realization that penny hasn't dropped everywhere, and not in Washington, not in European capitals. But for the Russians, they are, and they act accordingly. They feel they are in a state of conflict, and they are escalating whenever they can. And this is not only true of the GRU or the spooks or the saboteurs or the special clandestine operations unit or even Putin. This is true of the entire kind of Russian public. I speak Russian, so whenever I watch Russian television or look at the Russian internet kind of news reporting, there is a great sense that they are in conflict with NATO. They believe in Ukraine. They're fighting NATO. And this is how they explain to themselves why they can't beat Ukraine, why it's so difficult. This war has turned out to be such a meat grinder for them. Right. And the explanation to their mind is because NATO is fighting us in Ukraine, and Ukraine is only a tool for the greater kind of evil designs of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this is the mentality. They do believe that not only Nord Stream, but a string of other attacks on Russian soil that were perpetrated by Ukraine and the Ukrainian intelligence, such as assassinations in the middle of Moscow of senior security officials. They even assassinated a kind of a nationalist blogger. They've sent drones into their critical infrastructure. They even hit the Kremlin with a drone at one point. So the Russians believe that the CIA is supporting all of that, that the West is kind of supporting all of that. And, in some cases, they're not wrong, because what's happening since last year, one of the final edicts of President Biden was to allow for a long or mid-range missiles made in the United States to be used against Russian targets inside Russia.
The ATACMS.
The ATACMS missiles, then you have the Storm Shadows from Great Britain, and both these weapon systems require personnel from the respective countries and targeting data from the respective countries. So what's happening, you have American boots on the ground, few of them, but you have them, and you have British boots on the ground in Ukraine who are sort of operating these weapons or helping operate these weapon systems and feeding them with proprietary data in order to enable precise targeting. So in a sense, they are, targeting Russian targets inside Russia.
Yeah.
That is happening. That part is happening. Obviously, I don't believe that the CIA blew up Nord Stream or that the CIA is helping Ukrainians kill Russian officials in Moscow. I actually think expressly the CIA tries to prevent that sort of thing from happening, and they don't like it from what I hear. But that doesn't stop the Russians from believing that the Americans and the West is behind everything.
So one note about the proxies. Intelligence agencies forever have used proxies for some of their dirty work, but it does seem to be on the rise worldwide because of the World Wide Web and the ability to recruit people in chat rooms or online. I've noticed that the Iranians have also tried to do this within the United States to conduct assassinations. So this seems to be a newly popular technique. It seems like it's rather costless. If the guy they don't even know that they recruited online is arrested by the FBI or otherwise foiled, there's no real blowback on the mother country, is there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, proxy war is the war of today and perhaps the war of the future. I think the pioneers of proxy war were the Israelis, from what I was told. Decades ago, they started using Arabs to hit Arab targets, and the people who worked for the Israelis didn't even know they worked for the Israelis. And I think a lot of people were watching this closely, including some of their targets in Iran and elsewhere, but also the Americans and the British and so on. So, with time, everyone started using proxies because the political climate changed in the Western countries. I think, obviously it's not the 70s anymore. The CIA doesn't go around kind of organizing coups and deposing democratically elected socialist leaders. It's a completely different ballgame now, and that sort of stuff is no longer kind of acceptable. So it's very unlikely to have American citizens serving in the American, system, doing stuff like that the way they used to do it in the 70s. So now, proxies are the order of the day for everyone. And one great advantage of the proxies that Russia has had during this war is that they are cheap, comparatively cheap. They offer plausible deniability because in most cases, in the vast majority of cases, the proxies don't even know who they're working for, and there's never going to be a proof in the, nobody will be able to prove in a court of law that they were hired by the Russian intelligence services. And the Russians are just sitting back in Moscow in their office and controlling these people on remote control via social media and Telegram apps and stuff like that. And, they don't care. They can pay anything between a few $100s to a few $1,000s, maybe a few tens of thousands of dollars if it's really important and so on. But it's a fairly easy and cheap way to inflict disproportionate amount of damage on their targets. And as you rightly said, the Iranians have obviously also learned that this is possible, and they're doing it not just in America, they're doing it in Europe. The Iranians have been hiring criminals in Germany, for example, from biker gangs, the Hells Angels and people like that, to do their dirty work and to even kind of plot terrorist activities against Israeli/Jewish targets in Europe. So that's, I think, very much going to be accelerating and escalating. And it's also, the Baltic incidents, some of them are definitely a result of using proxies, because you can use a civilian vessel to cut a cable with the anchor, or to, in one particular case that I have in mind, shortly days before the war, there was a Russian fishing trawler that used the trawling equipment to cut a crucial data cable. And when the Norwegian prosecutor and the police boarded the ship, and I spoke to the Norwegian prosecutor who told me this, the captain basically said, yeah, of course I was there. There was a bunch of fish. And they told him, but yeah, you crossed that particular spot something like 200 times. Why did you do that? That's very unusual behavior for a trawler.
Yeah.
And he said it was just a bunch of fish. I didn't know there was a cable there. I'm terribly sorry. And so, the limits of the rule of law in a democracy are pretty severe. The prosecutor was not able to prosecute this captain. I mean, I think the net result was he had to pay a fine and was banned from fishing there for a short period of time. But that was it, and the prosecutor did believe there was some sort of intention behind this, but it wasn't able to prove it. And so I think that sort of stuff we'll see a lot of it happen more and more because it's cheap, it's convenient, it's easy. And I think in a way, at least for the Russians, they are kind of using the rule of law against the democracies. Obviously, if a Norwegian fishing trawler would go into Russian waters and do something like that, the Russians could easily arrest him or shoot him down or whatever, and then ask questions later. So, that's a slight advantage they have over Western democracies.
So, Bojan, let me ask you the big question here, and that has to do with the United States. There was a rumor that at least one warehouse had caught fire somewhere in Arkansas. People weren't sure whether to attribute this to these new Russian efforts. But tell me if you can, does the new spy unit that's leading Russia's shadow war include activities in the continental United States?
I mean, the answer to that is a question, why would it not include activities in the United States? The United States is the biggest enemy of Russia. The Russians think they are behind everything that's bad happening to them in this war. So why wouldn't they? I mean, there was a situation where the border was wide open for a long period of time. Anyone could have infiltrated operatives if they wanted to. So, I mean, I do have some leads sort of indicating that sort of stuff, but I don't have evidence. I've not written about it, so I wouldn't like to talk about it in any kind of detail. But I think the question you need to ask yourself is why not? Because typically in a crime you're looking for the ability to do the crime, the kind of and the motive. These are two key things, and obviously these things are well documented in this particular case. So they have the ability, they have the motive. Did they have the opportunity? They seem to have had the opportunity. So remains to be seen. I have no evidence of that, so I wouldn't like to comment.
Let's, as we begin to wind up here, is there a sense though that the West needs to have an organized defense against this new spy unit and its shadow wars? I know the CIA often shares intelligence, has great relationships with many of its European counterparts, but is there anything that they're going to do in particular to try to thwart this particular threat, or is it just among the many other things that each station in Europe is trying to collect on?
I think there is a sense that they need to up their game collectively. I think there is, as you said, intelligence sharing, but it's not adequate enough for a state of basically hybrid war with a major adversary such as Russia. So the intelligence operatives I've spoken to in many countries are happy that there is cooperation, but they don't think it's sufficient, and they do think they need to improve the cooperation. I think a lot of them are saying that we need to there is a sense that Russia understands only one language, and that is the language of strength. And they feel not enough strength has been demonstrated to deter them from doing what they're doing. Obviously, I don't know what was said in those phone calls that we discussed earlier, but obviously there's a new administration. There are new appointments. There is, all the services have new leaders. So we'll see whether the posture changes now under the new American administration. Certainly, in one of the hearings, the hearing of Tulsi Gabbard, I think it was, the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Tom Cotton, said that he would like to see the CIA become much more forward-leaning and boost its clandestine kind of pushback against Russia. And this is what I've heard from kind of veteran operatives in and out of service who said, if we start doing to them what they're doing to us, they'll think twice about escalating again. So it remains to be seen. I think that there are a lot of initiatives, there are a lot of conversations. Some people will say, and these people, for example, are in Germany, they will say, well, maybe we shouldn't escalate because it will only get worse. Maybe we should try to kind of de-escalate.
Right.
And then you've got some sort of more aggressive-minded people, for example, in Britain, who say deterrence is the only way forward. The Russians do understand deterrence, and they always react to it. And if you let them do whatever they do, they'll just do it more. So there's logic to both approaches, but so far I think that the more conciliatory approach has somehow prevailed, perhaps, and then we'll see now with the Trump administration whether there will be a more forceful posture or whether there will be a deal around Ukraine that will maybe settle the affairs in this department as well. Remains to be seen.
So just to make sure I've got my arms around it all, we've listed a bunch of activities that qualify as sabotage. And you did mention cyber attacks and disinformation, but is there anything on the subversion front? Not to say disinformation isn't serious, it is, but have there been any activities in particular to take out unfriendly governments in Europe?
I don't think they have the capacity to take out unfriendly governments. I think they've been pushing to the sort of usual online stuff. They've been, using social media to boost the campaigns of some political parties that they feel are more in line with what they want to see in Europe. And that's interesting because they support the far left and the far right. It's very interesting. There's no ideology there. It's just supporting a certain type of disruption.
Right.
But I don't know how important these things are. You can get a bunch of ads on the internet or a bunch of bots on X or Twitter. Does this have influence on how people vote? I mean, it's very difficult to say. I've never seen any evidence of actually masses of people voting a certain way just because they were exposed to some psyops on the internet. So I'd be skeptical about that. But I mean, what they're definitely doing, they tried to kind of kill the biggest, the executive of the biggest German company that supplies Ukraine. I mean, that's a big deal. Had they succeeded in that, I mean, I guess the idea of doing that is to sort of instill fear in the bones of European decision makers. And, if you are a chief executive of a company like that, do you want to live for the rest of your life with bodyguards moving into your house and kind of watching over your children? Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty tough, thing to contemplate. And obviously this guy seems to be fine with it. I mean, he was very gung-ho. He's very pro-Ukrainian. But that's not necessarily how everyone else would see it. So I think they're pushing wherever they feel there's weakness and opportunity. And they seem to kind of select countries they think are susceptible to their operations, including Germany, for example. They think that in Germany there are a lot of people who are kind of pro-Russian or are worried about escalating the conflict with Russia. And so they feel they're kicking at an open door in that sense.
Well, Bojan, you have a terrific beat for the Wall Street Journal if you're covering everything from Russian sabotage, subversion, all the way through Hell's Angels. That's about as good as it gets. So,
yeah. And then some.
And then some. Well, congratulations on this scoop in the Wall Street Journal last week about the new spy unit in Russia's shadow war. Thank you so much for being on Intelligence Matters. This was fascinating.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a great pleasure.
That was Bojan Panchevski. I'm Michael Allen. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.